Alright, let's get on to the one moment that has been talked about to death about this film, and that is, of course, the dance number.
Yeah.
This scene is about as silly and over the top and what the fuck as you remembered it. Because it was like that for me. When I watched this back in 2007, when I was 9 years old, I was like, okay, am I watching a different movie? And I was like, I mean, it's cringeworthy, and at the same time, it's kind of hilarious because it's so over the top and just so like, what is happening that you just like begin to question what is going on.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more odd than you'd normally see in a Spider-Man film. But I think like, uh, perhaps a possible inspiration for that film could have been the casino scene in the Mac in the Mask movie, where like the Mask is watching a performance, then he just decides, hey, let's rock this joint, just and then he starts moving around, taking care of things, stealing the show, so to speak. And I think maybe to a degree that's what they were going for, but at the same time, it was, I think, meant to, keep portraying a different side of Peter Parker, like compared to his usual self, and show that the symbiote possibly still was getting stronger and still possessing him even up to this point. He'd been wearing it practically nonstop.
Yeah,
Just
and
showing.
he, because with this dance number, he manages to embarrass both Gwen and MJ at the same time. He gets in a fight with the bouncers and accidentally ends up hitting MJ
Yeah.
when this causes him to realize what the symbiote has been doing to him. He then decides to go to a church bell tower, which it leads to the famous moment with him ripping the symbiote off. And Eddie just so happens to visit the exact same church, which is a bit convenient at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of like what Peter said, I think he took that point from what Peter said about how, you want forgiveness? Get religion. So he went to a church to try to do that. And while he's there, he sees Peter basically at the church trying to rip the black suit off because he realized just how much it corrupts him. So he's trying to go back to being himself. And it's just like out there, really. I mean, he's like trying his best to get that thing off, and it just won't cling.
Yeah, and when it eventually like detaches itself from Peter and bonds to Brock, the imagery is pretty horrifying, especially when it just jiggles itself and bonds itself to Brock,
Yeah, like a
and
rainstorm out in the middle of
yeah, and
church.
even
Ew.
going down his throat.
Little bit, anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Ew.
and this eventually leads to his transformation into Venom.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the freakiest scenes for me growing up back then.
Yeah, and when it comes to like the one moment with Aunt May and Peter, I do think it's really touching, like how like she tries to remind him that he's a good person and he'll put things right in time with MJ.
Yeah.
And I was a bit disappointed how this was left out in the editor's cuts
Yeah.
because I was like, why did you leave that out?
Yeah,
Just
I
like,
never understood because they take that out, but they still keep in the part about right after Sandman's supposed murder. Aunt May pretty much gives this speech about how she's shocked at the fact Spider-Man killed him, but at the same time, even though he killed Uncle Ben, she says that she doesn't think it's for us to decide whether a person gets to live or die. I mean, at the same time, she says, don't live with revenge in your heart because revenge is like a poison, can take us over and basically just eventually turn us into something we're not.
yeah, that's in a way it's definitely true.
Yeah,
And that's further explained with Venom because he's because Brock is left with nothing but revenge in his heart, and he found his poison, the symbiote, which takes him over and turns him into something ugly. Venom tracks down Sandman and they propose an alliance to kill Spider-Man. And of course, they kidnap MJ, which of course is a trope that has never been run to the ground at this point, with MJ becoming the damsel in distress for the third act.
Mm.
And for the first time since the ending of the first act of the film, Peter gets his regular costume back, which I've always loved.
Yeah.
And when he tries to get Harry to assist him in taking down Venom and Sandman, of course he tells him to piss off. And I like the one scene in the editor's cut where he just looks at a picture of him and Peter and MJ, and he just sheds a tear. And this causes him to change his mind to help Peter, and this would eventually lead to the final battle. But before that, in the theatrical cut, the butler, after all this time, explains the truth about how Norman actually died. And I'm like, why did you wait until now to finally bring this up? Because you've seen all this time that Harry has been obsessing over getting revenge on Spider-Man, and you never thought for one second saying Spider-Man did not kill your father; he died by his own hand. And it's just like a big plot hole, and it's just like I'm glad that they resolved that in the editor's cut.
I personally found that the editor's cut was an interesting way to go about it. I enjoyed the fact that looking at a picture of his friends helped him out. But as far as a plot hole goes, for the butler being the reason that he finds out the truth in the theatrical cut, I can understand why people would be upset about that after quite a long time, I might add. Sometimes even I used to think like that. But here's what I think was the point behind that. My guess is that, like, for example, in the Civil War movie, Captain America Civil War, we find out that Cap actually knew that Bucky killed
Yeah.
Tony's parents all the way back then, but he never told them. He later explains that he was doing it because he thought he was protecting him, and I like to think that's
What the butler was doing for Harry.
yeah, I like to think that that's what Bernard was trying to do. Bernard is his name,
Yeah.
and I thought maybe he thinks that by not telling Harry what really happened to his dad, maybe he was protecting him somehow. But when he realized that Harry was really involved in a lot of the New Goblin stuff, perhaps,
Yeah.
he finally had no reason not to tell him. So he decided to give him concisive proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that Peter didn't do it and that he should go help him.
And he eventually does, because when Peter goes in solo to fight Venom and Sandman, he predictably gets his ass handed to him and is nearly killed by Sandman. And when we get to the moment when Harry finally steps in to assist Peter against Venom and Sandman, and I've always liked it. It's a pretty good inspirational moment. It's good to see their friendship finally reform and they settle their differences. It's really satisfying. And I like how Harry takes out Sandman. But before that even happens, some of the CG, there are moments where it holds up, and there's moments when it doesn't, especially when you get like the moment with Peter swinging with MJ and trying to get her to safety. And it's just, it looks so fake. But how everything else is handled, it's for the most part pretty good.
Yeah.
But right when Venom is about to kill Spider-Man, Harry sacrifices himself to save Peter and meets the same fate as his father, with him being impaled by his own glider when Venom tries to impale Spider-Man. And of course, Peter remembers the symbiote's weakness to loud sound, and he clings like a couple of pipes together and makes like a little barrier.
Sound cage.
Yeah, like a little sound cage, which causes him to finally separate Eddie from the symbiote.
Yeah.
And it's become so powerful enough that it doesn't need to survive without a host.
Or at least that it's capable of sustaining itself for a short time without one. But as far as the sound cage goes, I really thought that was like
a really interesting idea. Yeah, and he throws a Punka bomb to destroy the symbiote, and Eddie's not wanting to let it go, so he tries to bond with it before the bomb goes off.
And it kills them both.
Yeah, and if you look real closely, you can see, I mean, Eddie's skeleton right when the bomb goes off.
In addition to the symbiote about to be burned alive, it's like you could see them both in a little light fixture right before the explosion.
Yeah, and we get this emotional scene with Peter and Flint as he like explains the truth about the death of Uncle Ben, which turns out to be in fact an accident. Right when he tries to steal his car, Uncle Ben actually tries to like, I mean, he actually tries to calm him down, saying, "Why don't you just put down the gun and go home?" And that's when Flint realizes that he was actually trying to help him. That wasn't until like Carradine like surprised him, and he accidentally, and then Flint accidentally shoots Uncle Ben. And since then, he has regretted that. And Peter, I like how Peter finds it in his heart to forgive him, which kind of like brings a satisfying end to Sandman's story arc. And eventually, Harry dies from his wounds, and we then get his scene at his funeral. And the film ends with Peter visiting MJ at the jazz club, where they begin to patch up their relationship.
Yeah.
But we don't know how the rest will turn out because 5 years after Spider Man 3 was released, Sony decided to reboot the series with The Amazing Spider Man,
Yeah.
and we'll end up talking about that. But before we end this off, right before we discuss our verdict on the film, let's go over the concepts and the ideas for Spider-Man 4. So there was like many ideas for Spider-Man 4, and eventually, I mean, one of the few ideas that Sam Raimi wanted, he wanted to include the Vulture for Spider-Man 4, and as well as Black Cat, who in this version would turn out to be Vulture's daughter, who would have an affair with Peter in order to break off his engagement with Mary Jane, and have Dr. Connors finally transform into the Lizard. And there was also even a lot of rumors suggesting that Bruce Campbell would get a big role in the franchise, appearing as Mysterio, which I would have liked.
Yeah, I actually, at one point, I came across this little concept that pretty much is a little continuation from Spider Man 3 where Mysterio's robbing a bank and Spider Man stops him, unmasks him, and it turns out to be, possibly Quentin Beck, who's, I think, at the time was going to be played by Bruce Campbell, but they never got around to it.
Yeah, because Sam Raimi went through like many drafts and was never happy with any of them. And there was even an idea of shooting a fourth and fifth Spider-Man movie back to back, but
Yeah.
of course that didn't happen. And of course we got the Amazing Spider-Man in 2012, which we'll discuss pretty soon. But overall, when it comes to Spider-Man 3, I do think that it's not perfect by any means. I don't think it's bad either. I mean, I've seen far worse superhero movies than this. And I do think like its major issue is mostly its script because I mean it's trying to like balance like way too many characters and subplots into one film, and in some way they try to make it work and with very mixed results.
Yeah.
So overall, I do think I mean I like some of the performance, most of its action sequences, and it has a great score, and I like how it's shot, especially when you have like Bill Pope like adding up the upping up the colors and the contracts, which makes it feel more like a comic book.
Yeah.
And but overall, I don't. I mean, really like what they do with certain characters, and particularly Venom and Gwen Stacy. Some choices, as always, bothered me, and some other things. I mean, in particular, the dance number has bothered me for years. So overall, I mean, Spider-Man 3 is a bit of a mixed bag for me. I don't hate it. I do think it's fine for what it is, and you can enjoy it. I mean, just don't go in saying, I mean, don't go in thinking that it's going to be perfect or anything. I would recommend the editor's cut though. So,
Yeah.
I'm going to give Spider-Man 3 a B minus.
Yeah. And I would like to say just one thing
Yeah.
on this front. I totally agree. I think in for the most part, just about everything that Brevin said. This film definitely has a lot of mixed baggage. You know, just one person or another could think one thing, the other could think the other. But in my book, it's basically, it's not just what the film's about that may or may not be a disappointment. It's about who watches it in particular, like, you know, what their interests are, just about the person in general. A lot of people may love it, a lot of people may hate it. It's really back and forth, but overall, I think it's still a good movie that was, I think, worth the effort. Even
Yeah.
if it turned out to be a little different than most Spider-Man films we came to know.
Yeah, I mean, I still think that some of the cast give off great performances. In particular, Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, James Franco, J.K. Simmons, and Thomas Hayden Church, Rosemary Harris, and Bryce Dallas Howard. Even though I think her role in the film was completely pointless
At
in
the end
some
of the day,
ways.
yeah, it
Yeah.
just depends on like a certain point of view, I guess. But for the most part, I guess maybe she didn't have too much impact, but it was nice that she was there.
Oh yeah. But overall, I mean, I just think the film is just fine. That's just about it, really.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. So, Cameron, thank you so much for supporting me for this review. And, guys,
Yeah.
thank you so much, as always, for watching. Looking forward to doing more videos really soon. And if you want my thoughts on old or new movies, of course, you know where to find me.